So Dr. McCallam is a recognized security expert in the discovery, development, and deployment of cybersecurity technology. He is a Northrop Grumman Fellow and is responsible for defensive cyber operations research and applications at Northrop Grumman Mission Systems, and has several patents in the cybersecurity area. Dr. McCallam has served as a U.S. delegate associated with numerous NATO technology committees since 2005, and is currently the U.S. appointed chair for the IST-129 Task Group on Predictive Analytics of Adversarial Cyber Operations. So we have a terrific panel here. Thank you very much for such a distinguished group coming from Sweden, from Estonia, from the State Department, and from the Department of Homeland Security. So I'll pass it to you, Dr. McCallam, and we look forward to a great panel. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and welcome everyone to the Global Cyber Threat Panel. I'd like to set some context for a discussion, but before I do that, it's my honor to introduce our very distinguished and international panel. We have on the far end, starting down the left, John Felker. In August of 2015, John Felker joined the Senior Executive Service and assumed leadership of the National Cybersecurity and Communications Integration Center at DHS. The NCIC is the U.S. government's 24/7 hub for cybersecurity information sharing, incident response, and coordination. Prior to joining DHS, Mr. Felker served in the Coast Guard for 30 years in various command and staff assignments and served as Director of Cyber and Intelligence Strategy for HP Enterprise Services. He is a graduate of Ithaca College and earned his Master of Arts in Public Administration from Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. Next is Robert Strayer. Mr. Strayer is the Deputy Assistant Secretary for Cyber and International Communications and Information Policy at the U.S. Department of State. Before joining the State Department, Mr. Strayer was the General Counsel for the U.S. Senate Foreign Relations Committee under the leadership of Senator Bob Corker. He also held positions at the Director of Homeland Security Project at the Bipartisan Policy Center and served as counsel and then Republican Deputy Staff Director on the U.S. Senate Homeland Security and Governmental Affairs Committee. He has earned his law degree from Vanderbilt University Law School. Next is Taimar Peterkop. Mr. Peterkop is the Director General of the Information Systems Authority, where he is responsible for coordinating Estonia's national cybersecurity and developing Estonia's e-government platform. He has graduated from the University of Tartu Faculty of Law and holds a master's degree in strategic studies from the United States Army War College. He is also a reserve officer. And finally, Richard Oehme is a Director of Cybersecurity and Critical Infrastructure Protection at PwC Sweden. He leads the business area for cybersecurity, risk, and resilience. Mr. Oehme has decades of experience in security policy, crisis preparedness, civil defense, cybersecurity, intelligence operations, and in the protection of critical infrastructure, as well as years of experience regarding national policy making. Actually, the backdrop, I think we have a slide for that we'd like to use is the discussion based on the Defense Science Board report of 2013 entitled Resilient Military Systems and the Advanced Cyber Threat. Why did I choose this? Part of that is because a couple years ago, my dissertation advisor looked at me and he goes, Dennis, you know, nobody really cares what you think. They care about what other people think about what you think. And what other people think is probably up there. This allows us to address the threat in terms of capability. And if you look at this kind of briefly at the top where the yellow is, those are the signature-based threats that use known vulnerabilities with known exploits. In the center are those threats that use known vulnerabilities with unknown exploits, a little harder to find. And at the bottom, they're the nation-state actors that use unknown and create unknown vulnerabilities with unknown exploits. So this gives us a branch to talk about capability of the threat. And this will allow us to address this in terms of capabilities, more universal in terms of cyber threat, but avoids all sorts of issues with respect to specific group identification. The sixth level of organization is probably a really good way. It's something I've been using for a couple of years as a backdrop to introduce things. Reports online, it's easily available, and it's kind of a good read. So now that we've done all that, let's jump directly into finding out what some other people think, and they are a lot smarter than I am and have a lot better perspective on things. So for the first question I'd like to throw out, in the past few years, we've seen changes in attacking styles with destructive malware. WannaCry, Equifax, the OPM breach. What do you think will be some of the future trends, or in other words, what are the emerging and future technologies we'll have to worry about most from a security perspective? Richard, can I throw that?
Yeah, absolutely. First of all, I think we have to fix the problems of the 90s, to be honest. I mean, there's so much stuff out there we haven't actually got into, for example, DNSSEC, IPv6, which actually make it possible for the aggressors to come to us and actually hurt us. So we have to fix those problems first. Then there's a problem, as I see it, is the threat escalation and in the cyber domain completely, where we have a lot of situations where more and more non-state actors actually can come in and hurt us really bad. And the reason for that is really that we are so badly protected. And if you see that coming, unfortunately, I'm going to see it's going to be a lot worse before it's going to get better. So that's my little bit pessimistic view right now, but we can fix it with new technology and with new corporations, actually. So first of all, it's going to be a little bit worse, and then I think it's going to be better, but we have to watch out.
Yes, Taimar, please.
Thank you. In cyber, to look ahead and think of what's coming next, it's a very tricky thing, because every day we learn from a new aspect of a already existing vulnerability. So what we see, I think, in the past year, what we've seen is that the solutions that we've been using for several years have security flaws in them. Spectre, Meltdown, Roca, Crack. It's if you know what this means, it's the solutions, chips, processors that we've been using for years, and now we discover that they have serious vulnerabilities in there. So they would be somewhere in the middle there. There is a nation states, academia, criminals are putting more and more effort into studying the existing stuff that we use, and using then the vulnerabilities that they discover. So I think in the coming future we have to deal with more and more of these types of vulnerabilities. Of course, we can talk about these nice things as buzzwords like artificial intelligence and quantum computing and what are they bringing, but I think this is something that are nice declarations in that, but we really cannot do much, or there isn't much to do. But everyday life we have to face the already existing vulnerabilities and deal with them. Thank you.
Doctor, thank you for the question. Good morning. Appreciate being here today and you organizing this panel. Given the interconnected nature of the internet and information and communications technologies, it's vital that we think about the international aspects of it, because we need to cooperate together, working not just with government and other governments, but with the private sector as well to address those. So I think it's impressive and to be applauded that the Billington Cybersecurity Summit is addressing this global threat in an international panel in this manner with my colleagues that work from Sweden and Estonia. I just think it's also important, before we touch on the threats, to think about what's at stake. The internet over the last less than 3 decades ago is when we invented the World Wide Web, has grown into something that's a multi-trillion-dollar asset to an economy. It's led to shared prosperity around the world. It's allowed people to communicate in unforeseen ways, to participate in their futures, and to shape the course of their democracies. So it's something that's a very vital asset that we need to think about how we protect and address it with the appropriate amount of resources and thought and effort. On the threat landscape, our intelligence community in 2018, very recently, through its worldwide threat assessment, noted that we're seeing at least 4 state actors, Russia, China, North Korea, and Iran, pursuing cyber operations as a low-cost tool of statecraft that they seek to use to achieve their strategic objectives. Further, it noted that some of those states are seeking to use more aggressive cyber attacks that are presenting a growing threat to the United States and our partners. We're also seeing non-state actors being more aggressive, and that's partly explained through the ubiquity of commercial malware that's now available to those actors. So we're going to see new actors, I think, come into the space. I also think it's important to recognize that we're becoming increasingly reliant on information communications technology. I know we all sort of know that in our daily lives, but I think to think in a couple years forward, as we see the rollout of 5G and more technology that's reliant, completely reliant on having that just-in-time data for those systems to operate effectively, we're going to be increasingly vulnerable to disruptions of those technologies through cyber means. We need to think about that as the threat that we're going to face in years ahead. And in the United States, we're doing a number of things to try to address these threats. Most importantly, we're seeking to set standards, rules of the road with regard to these state actors. So we've worked through the UN and other places to establish that international law applies to cyberspace, and there are norms of responsible state behavior. We've gotten basically all the key players in the G20 to agree that there are norms of responsible state behavior in cyberspace. And following on that, this administration is seeking to hold accountable malicious state actors. We've done that in a number of realms. So we've called out North Korea for the WannaCry attack. We've attributed NotPetya to Russia just a few weeks ago. And then following on NotPetya, we implemented 24 sanctions against Russian entities last week. I'd also note it's important that we work with our partners on this. We got at least 9 other countries to join us in the attribution of NotPetya to Russia as the actor behind it. And I'd also note that last week we issued a joint technical alert, which I won't steal John's thunder here, regarding intrusions into our critical infrastructure systems by Russia. So it's important that we call these out, but that we also implement consequences against those bad acts. I just one note on one other sort of consequence. As we see one other threat. As we see a continuing convergence of sort of cybersecurity issues and digital economic issues, that is digital regulatory issues, they're sort of two halves of the same coin. What we decide in the regulatory space very much affects our ability to be effective on the cybersecurity front. So one example of that is the European Union's General Data Protection Regulation. It has a very good chance of causing disruption in what they call the WHOIS database, WHOIS registry, which I'm sure a number of you are aware of. It's a vital tool for those investigating cyber attacks to figure out who's behind a certain malicious domain. GDPR may also affect the ability of network protectors to retain the data they need to do follow-up investigations or to even validate that certain actors on their networks are malicious or non-malicious. So I think we got to be careful as we go forward the unintended consequence of digital regulations affecting our cybersecurity environment. And lastly, I'll just say about the private sector. Obviously, private sector is victims as well as government, and we know that it's nearly impossible to imagine a cyber threat that doesn't transit private infrastructure at some point. So the private sector is vital to us figuring out these cybersecurity solutions, and it's important then that we do have these discussions and think about these solutions in a multi-stakeholder format. It's not just governments, but it's, as I said at the beginning, it's working the private sector in a number of different venues where we can have a collaborative solution to the problems that we face. Thanks.
Go ahead, John.
Good morning. So you asked about changes in attacking style, and I think the smart guys on the panel here have addressed that fairly adequately. I do want to point out that we do see a lot of changes in terms of particularly what Robert mentioned about the stuff we've been used to for years. Now we're starting to see vulnerabilities deep inside them. Meltdown Inspector, one example. All of that has the potential to affect critical infrastructure, and I think as some of the reports that we pushed out in the last few weeks demonstrate, there's a concerted effort on the part of nation-state actors in particular to go after critical infrastructure, at least set up the potential for their ability to impact our use of critical infrastructure, electric grid being one of the most prominent ones that's been seen in the media recently. So those morphed sort of vulnerabilities and changes in different adaptations of the malware that we've seen in the past to go after those vulnerabilities that are now discovered is one of the changes in style. I think that there are more players, as Robert mentioned, in the space. And I think that's because the bar to entry is quite low. You don't have to be really smart from a cyber perspective to be an attacker. All you got to be able to do is get onto the dark web and buy a tool to allow you to do what you want, and they're there. So one of the things that we've been thinking about, we haven't done anything about it, but we've been thinking about how do we understand what's going on in the dark web a little bit more, so that we have a better picture of what those adversaries are behaving like, and how can we better defend against them. And at the end of the day, I think defense is most based on your ability to continue to do your work, whether it's mission or business, but understanding that the adversary is in your network, and continue to do what you need to do despite the fact that he's there. Oh, and there's a plus. If you can make it more expensive for him to get there while you're continuing to do your work, then you can have success in your business or your mission and still make it expensive for the bad guy, so he'll go look at somebody else who's a little weaker than you are, perhaps. So we think about all those things. One thing that Robert mentioned I think is important too, and I think David Coe said it earlier, and that is this cooperation aspect. How do we cooperate better? What are ways that we can share information? And I understand, we get beat up all the time about not being able to share classified information. I regularly beat up some of my private sector partners because they won't share proprietary information. So how do we strike a proper balance here that allows us to share in a trusted environment so that we all know what's going on? Because at the end of the day, this is a team sport. You cannot survive by yourself. It's not possible. So how do we create structures and process to allow us to share both with our critical infrastructure private sector partners and with our international partners this information that can be gathered through the work that we do? So I think all of those things point to our reaction to change in the style of attacking.
Thank you all. That covers quite a bit of territory. If you sit and you think about some of the responses there, all the way from looking at the current state of affairs with flaws in it to what the future is going to bring in terms of continuous operation. So trailing onto that a little bit, kind of in my opinion, this breakdown we put up here also covers a lot of territory when you start delineating the threat in terms of what they can and cannot do and where they're doing their attacking with critical infrastructure, supply chain, financial institutions, data-rich environments. So that's kind of a today view. So understanding that we're sort of operating right now with the threat in the system, how does this sort of change our view of resiliency? And John, I'd like to ask you to kick that one off.
Okay, so we talked about this earlier, and I'm going to quote a friend and mentor, Chris Inglis, used to be the deputy director of the NSA, and I can't remember exactly when, but probably 2010 or 11-ish. He came right out and said in a meeting that I was attending that we have to change our paradigm for cyber defense. We must. You can no longer keep the bad guy out. So you need to understand that the adversary is in your network. How then do you continue to operate? Knowing full well that he's there, knowing full well that potentially he could impact your business or mission at any moment, and how do you keep him from doing that to allow you to continue to do business? So we are thinking about those things. How do you do that? How do you create a way? And this is sort of creative, and one of my friends thought this up, not me. I'm not that smart. But how do you create a way for the adversary to think he's in your network, but he's not? He hits your tripwire, and you do something else with him, so that he still thinks he's seeing everything that he wants to see, but he isn't really. So essentially, you've got him in a portion of your network. But you're continuing to do mission or operations over here, and he's fat, dumb, and happy over there thinking he's getting everything you want. And oh, by the way, you could even feed him some junk if you really want to mess with him. So thinking about those kinds of things, I think, are the next steps, at least in my view, and some folks that I've dealt with in the past north of the river that think the same way.
Okay, good.
Thanks. I think that's excellent. Just let me add just one more aspect to that on the international side, and that would be that we need to keep maturing the capabilities of our partners around the world, because these threats do spread around the world quickly, or they can originate in a country. For example, Petya originated in Ukraine and quickly spread around the world. So we need to think about how we can enhance the abilities of others to identify, detect, and respond to threats in their territories, and to let us know about those threats. So we've seen a great deal of maturity happening in the CERT-to-CERT cooperation level. But I think we need to think about how we increase that to the policymaker level, that those making decisions in countries, particularly if we see something that's a truly significant, catastrophic type of level of attack, that there's an ability to communicate that around the world to other political leadership.
I think you jumped on a really good point. We have really great relationships with many CERTs, 211 around the world. And there's a lot of analyst-to-analyst crosstalk and sharing that goes on. But the next key element, I think, as Robert says, is how do we elevate that to a policy level so that we're operating on the same plane from a policy perspective?
Taimar, would you like to add?
Yeah. I think cyber is a bit different than the conventional areas of security, in that sense that it's really very difficult to predict what's coming in the future. So everything that we can predict and learn from is very little, because every week basically we learn something new, that there is a hybrid threat, that cyber enables some new threat. In the past week, we've been talking about Cambridge Analytica. It's also cyber-enabled. So we are learning every day that some parts of the functioning of the society is depending on cyber, and then there is somebody is very creative in misusing that part. So what the Estonians have concluded is that yes, we do have those core scenarios that we are preparing for, but it doesn't probably help us in the long run. So we need to create a culture that is agile, flexible, and can respond. And if something happens, that something unseen something unseen or unthought of happens to us, that we will be able to recover and continue in a very smooth manner. This is what we did in 2007. And in last year, we had a major crisis when we had to shut down half of the national ID cards, and we overcame the issue basically in a few months' time very smoothly. And it's a culture of the entire ecosystem: government, businesses, academia, proactively working together. And that culture you need to nourish.
Yes, we'll take a different approach here. In my former position as head of the cybersecurity and critical infrastructure protection in Sweden, I was very keen on creating a private-public partnership with the different types of industry. We have forums for finance, industrial control system, we have them for healthcare, we have them for telecom providers, for cloud providers, etc. And why is that important? And you have really to nurture those environments, and you have to give them something back, because it has to be a added value for both parts when you're dealing with this. So our added value and their added value shown at least with two large incidents in Sweden. The first one was in 2016, when the two big media houses was attacked by huge DDoS attacks from around the globe. So both the media houses went down, and they had all their stuff, so to speak, in the same IT environment. So about 10, 20 papers in each of those environments went down. At that morning, when that happened, a telecom provider, or two of the telecom providers, called us and said that we know what this is. They are attacking the two tabloid papers, but since they put all the stuff in the same basket, so to speak, they are all going down. So that was a major issue, which led all the way into the Prime Minister's office, where I was speaking and explaining what was happening at that time. But without the good cooperation, we haven't noticed that. The other example I would take is from 2017, when a big mast was sabotaged, a huge telecom mast, the very, very high ones, was sabotaged, and it's still unresolved. Just 2 days later, or 3 days later, the Arlanda airport, which is the major hub for Stockholm, went down. And at that time, people were a little bit skittish and began to talk about what is happening right now. And just a couple of hours later on, the state railway system, booking system went down. And at that time, a lot of people were screaming actually that this is the third generation warfare is coming up. But on that morning, the big telecom provider Telia called us and said, it's our fault that Åland is going down. And the reason for that is we don't want to disclose us right now, but you have to know it's not an attack. So with that information, we actually went out and we also reached out to the state railway system, and they said that, well, it's a new booking system, so it was a manual DDoS attack. Everyone was calling in trying to rebook tickets to come away from Stockholm that day. So what is the story of this? Because if they trust us, they share this type of information, and we could actually go out there and actually speak with everybody and say that this is nothing what has happened, or this is what has happened, which is as important. So private-public partnership in so many different ways, but there has to be added value for both or actors in that sense.
Oh, yeah, I agree. And it's interesting, again, we have a common theme here of not only sharing information, but sharing lessons learned. And with some incidents that have happened in particular that some of our panelists have cited, that's a good area for us to learn from to see what we need to go ahead and do next. So now, given those first two questions, I had two related follow-up, and I'm actually going to flip what we had in the thing to go to the education one first. There was a recent Forbes article that reported the cybersecurity talent shortage to be upwards of 3.5 million worldwide by 2021. And this is a sequence of articles that Forbes has had over the last couple of years. And the one constant thing about it is the number keeps rising all the time. How are you addressing this challenge in today's very competitive cyber talent market? And what do you think should come from our educational institutions? And that's really all levels, elementary, high school, and university. So.
I think it's a twofold strategy. First of all, you have to actually use the staff you have. And secondly, I think government and private companies really have to educate a lot more. But an example, once again, the biggest provider of food in Sweden was a shortage of COBOL programmers. They was just too aged. They went out and what they did was they hunt down to the storage and looked for young talent people as they could actually educate as COBOL programmers. So I think you have to have that type of programs ongoing in the short run. In the long run, we have to allocate a lot more resources into education and actually demand for the educational system really to develop those guys. Because in Sweden, for example, I think it's 3 master programs on cybersecurity on the engineerings, and that's way too long. And there's no small education in the rest for lawyers, for economics, and for other stuff. You really have to develop that environment completely different from now.
Okay, Taimar?
It has to have a multi-layer approach. There isn't any simple solution. Otherwise, somebody would have done that already. But educating entire educational system, they need to produce more. Of course, we need to re-educate the already existing personnel we have. I think it's easier to do it to learn basic skills in how to proper cyber hygiene. If you're a manager of a company that you understand that IT, while it brings a lot of good things, that there are risks that are coming with it, and you understand the risks and take measures, etc., etc., etc. So we need to already re-educate the existing people as well. But one step that is Estonia when Mr. Koch said that Singapore is a small country. Well, ours is smaller. What we do as a small country is that the government cannot have all the competencies. So our, as a strategic depth is the companies. So for instance, we have to use modern cryptography in order to keep the digital society of ours trustworthy. But the government don't have all the competencies necessary to do that. So we are knowingly relying on some key companies and universities, and that we know that we're never going to have that competency in the government. So to build those relationships knowingly, it's a new area that we are moving into as well.
Okay, Robert?
I would note that it's one of the 4 major lines of effort in the President's executive order from last May on cybersecurity is is improving the cybersecurity workforce. So it charged the Department of Homeland Security, the Commerce Department, Department of Defense, and the Office of D&I with providing findings and recommendations related to improving the workforce. So it's a major priority for this administration to figure out how we can improve the workforce. Secondly, I would say that I think there's a critical link in the elementary and secondary education realm in science and math that I think that we lose a lot of students who are into science and math at some point in there, but there's a gap before they finish high school of attention to those subjects and interest in pursuing those when they go to college. So I think it's really important we figure out how to keep students interested in that and pursuing careers in that area.
So you mentioned using the current staff, and I think that's a really great point. And I don't want you to think for a moment that I'm putting down current IT staff, and I don't want you to think for a moment that I'm putting down current people who are in cybersecurity educational programs, because those are all very important things that we need to do. But I think we need to think about it in a little bit different way. I'm a 30-year operator in the Coast Guard, and you have operations and you have support. We got to stop thinking about IT as support. We got to start thinking about it as operations. We got to think that the culture has to be changed. It's not just, I'm going to buy this little widget because I'm going to do this part of this business, but how does that part of the business fit into the broader picture? And then how do you change the culture in your IT organization to a culture which is based on compliance, to how can we continue to operate this business or this mission that we have in a more effective way, while still knowing, go back to what we said before, while still knowing that the adversaries are already in our network. How do we do that? And how do we get people to think about that? You know, the STEM education and the K-12 and all that stuff is really, really important. All those building blocks have to be there. But we've got to think, I believe, about changing the way we address how the folks are actually doing mission. And I think it's important to change that culture. I think the UK has made a couple of good steps in terms of aptitude testing. You know, they did a study recently where they did a trial out in the Middle East someplace that involved aptitude testing and then training in sort of a boot camp environment. And they had some pretty good success. They brought it back to the UK. They tried it there. They did really, really well. One of the things that they learned was that you don't need to have all this, really great STEM education, although it's helpful. You just need to have some innate aptitude. And the fellow who did the best in their program was a bartender before he started. Never even seen a computer. So that goes to tell you that it's not all about the tickets that you punch. It's not about a master's degree in cybersecurity. It's not about a CISSP and all those other little ticket punches. It's about, can you do the work, and how do we change people to think about doing the work, make it more interesting for them. One of the things that we're trying to do in DHS, and particularly in the NCIC, is to make it interesting for our folks, to make it a challenge every day. Come to work, let's find the challenge, let's go after the challenge, let's make it interesting, let's make it fun. Now, we can't pay what the private sector can pay, although we do have a temporary vehicle that allows us to give a pay bump, sort of like flight pay, if you're familiar with that in the military. It's an incentive pay to keep people in. So that's been working pretty well for us. But what I think in the long term we need to do, aside from maybe restructuring the way we look at paying cyber professionals, is also how do we seamlessly move them between government and private industry? How can you have a job in the government for 3 or 4 years, get pretty good at it, and then go to the private sector and learn something, or go to another government agency and learn something a little bit different? The NCIC is a relatively small organization. There's only about 400 or so feds, and so obviously when you have a bunch of really high flyers, promotion potential is a little bit limited when you only have 400 slots. So what we tell them is, yep, okay, you're promoted here, but realize this: the likelihood of you being promoted to the next level in this organization is 50-50 at best. We want to keep you, obviously, but we also realize that if you go somewhere else and have a different experience and gain more ground in terms of your capability, you're going to come back to us at some point in the future if we've made it exciting and interesting for you, if we've changed the culture and how we look at doing cybersecurity. And so you have this sort of positive flow of people that are in and out of the private sector and academia for that matter. And I think that's one of the things that we need to start thinking about.
I think it's sort of interesting that both of you picked on the STEM bit. I was actually at a school in Anne Arundel County the other day, South River, and I was blown away by the STEM program there and how much that has also permeated across the rest of the school to sort of raise the whole interest level. So that hopefully is going to be a little helpful. And then the job rotation issue, job rotation is just, I think, immense. It's a wide experience gathering thing. All of you distinguished panelists have had job rotations, if you think about it, and it's certainly been able to add to things. Tom, I wanted to make sure that we had some time for some audience questions. So if you...
Yes, I'd love to take questions. I can bring the microphone around to you. I had one quick question to begin with. With this august panel that we have before us, I'd be interested in your opinion whether we should have a more globally representative defensive system. And that, does the Five Eye Partnership, for instance, should that be expanded?
I can take on first. I think there are prosperous one. For example, it's you have IWN, which is International Watch and Warning Network, 15 countries, which is included in that: Sweden, US, Singapore, and some others. On the EU level, you have some of those groups. Another process which is very interesting, which is not operational, is the Meridian process, where you actually have policy making, which is ongoing. But there are processes, but the thing is, like John was talking about, how do you actually share information which is top classified? I was in a meeting between the US and Great Britain in 2001, and we were discussing how to dissolve and how to get secret information out there. And those days and soon, this has to be handled at machine speed if you're going to counter an attack. How do you do and how do you deal with that?
Continuing from there, the exchange of information and how to do that better internationally, I think we have very too many forums to do that. And what is still a problem is the lack of trust and the lack of will to share information. So this is what we need to deal with. But on a policy making level, I do think that we need a better approach that was already mentioned. Our previous president, Toomas Hendrik Ilves, has called for an alliance of like-minded nations in cyber. And I love what the United States is doing with attribution. It's in the past months. But in order for a small country like ours, if we are in trouble, to have it in a successful manner, to do it successfully, we need allies, and I think for that reason, this like-minded nations should cooperate more, so we can deal with cyber threats if they have happened more quickly and effectively. Thank you.
Thanks. Absolutely agree. We need to push beyond the Five Eyes in our partnerships, and that's exactly what we're doing. My office, the State Department, is in charge of our international diplomatic outreach in cyberspace. So we're working through regional forums, we're working through the UN group of government experts, and as I mentioned earlier, the G20, to establish these norms of responsible state behavior. We're also reaching out bilaterally constantly to articulate our vision for cyberspace. That's how we're seeking to develop a sort of general framework where countries will attribute bad activity and then seek to impose consequences in the longer term to try to impose consequences against those who act against those norms of responsible behavior.
So we want to build upon that sort of dialogue that Robert's group and the State Department have been fostering internationally at the next level down, which is how do we get analysts to get to know each other? Because at the end of the day, it's all about the Bubba network, right? You know, I know Fred, and Fred's over in this country, and Fred knows Susie over in that country, and we're all talking about the same thing, and it's happening now. That the only way you're going to have success is for those analysts to get to know each other, and as several of the folks up here have said, it's trust each other. How do we do that in a way that's effective? How do we do that in a way that protects the equities that are involved, if there are any? And that's one of the things that we've been working on for the past year. I think we've made some pretty good progress in our analyst-to-analyst relationship development. But you know, there's forums out there where We get to spend money and send our analysts out there to learn, to get better. And it goes back to keeping them, retaining the talent that you have. Hey, go to the first forum in Kuala Lumpur and meet some of the analysts from around the world that you're going to deal with on a day-to-day basis. So when WannaCry pops up, you'll be able to pick up the phone, or you'll be able to send a text, and you'll be able to say, hey, are you seeing what we're seeing? And then share. Because effectively, the analysts are the folks that are going to have, where we're going to have to change the culture, and they're the folks that are going to actually make the work happen in a tactical situation.
So we have a written question here, and we have one more also here. If we could take two more, is that okay with you?
It'll be lightning round, but we
Okay.
can definitely do that.
Great.
So we have a question from the floor. How would timely attribution of malicious cyber activity change the threat environment? Note, and that really, Robert, goes back to your specific attributions that you made while you were talking.
Yeah, I would just say it's important that we would agree that being as timely as possible and as close to the event to make it clear that someone's acting outside the norms of responsible state behavior. It's important.
Tom, I believe you had another question.
Thank you. And I applaud all your work, by the way, in fostering this global cooperation that you've discussed. One more question?
I'll make it a quick one. Matthew Baynard from Defense Daily. I just had a question for Mr. Strayer. I was wondering, I know he's not in place yet, but do you expect Mike Pompeo, I know Secretary Tillerson had done some cyber reorganization. Do you expect to stay on a similar path when Mr. Pompeo takes over that role? And then just a second quick question. The State Department's Global Engagement Center, what do you expect to see in terms of countering some disinformation and information warfare as part of a larger strategy to uphold sort of international norms?
So as just a little bit more background there, so in February, Secretary Tillerson sent a letter to the oversight committees and to the appropriators on the Hill saying that he wanted to create a bureau at the State Department, which is really the functional units of the State Department that would handle cyberspace and the digital economy, to elevate that to be headed by an assistant secretary or an ambassador at large. So that was the plan that was announced, and we're in continuing conversations with Capitol Hill about that. On the other parts of your question, I really don't want to get ahead of the secretary designate. I understand his nomination papers are now in process, and he'll have time to review these things. So unfortunately, I can't answer any more questions about sort of structures within the department.
Okay, and just as a wrap up, any further comments individually? Starting down at the end, John.
I think to keep in mind that we have to understand that we're operating with the adversary in our networks. And how do we continue to do that in a way that's effective for our business, our mission, and make it more expensive for the bad guys?
I would just add that I hope that folks hear a common sort of message from all of us, that I think that's showing there's an increasing amount of consensus and thinking about cyber issues internationally. I think that each year you hear more and more consensus, more and more sophistication about how we address cyber threats, and I think that's really important, as I said earlier, because of the interconnected nature. If we have outlier countries that aren't participating in our overall framework of addressing these threats, that's going to be an issue going forward. But I really think we're converging on similar thinking about these problems.
There's a lot of inertia when it comes to public sector governments, and the challenge to face this effectively, this threat is to change the culture, change the way we do business. That's the biggest challenge that we have to face, I believe.
I'm getting more and more worried about non-state actors and what they can do, since our critical infrastructure is so badly protected. And they will not have the same restrictions that the nation states have. And that worries me quite a lot. And we have to step up really hard to meet that kind of challenge.
Panelists, I'd like to thank you. It's been an honor to stand up here and ask you questions as opposed to sitting there and having to answer them. Your insight has been absolutely excellent for the group. Audience, thank you. Tom?